Well, hello out there in garden land, and welcome to the Inside Out Gardener. My name is Greg Dreiss. Big change in the weather this week here in upstate New York. Well, I'm kind of in the middle of no man's land between the end of the Hudson Valley and the beginning of the capital region. So, depending on how you want to argue where I am, I'm in Greene County, New York, where today, right now, it is 59 degrees outside and absolutely gorgeous, where a week ago it was in the 80s and humid. So let's talk gardening. If you want to catch more of the episodes of The Indoor Gardener, we are on Anchor, Spotify, YouTube. Just Google The Inside Out Gardener with Greg Dreiss, and you'll come up with all kinds of information on both inside and outdoor gardening. Today, we're going to talk about a newer invasive species, the Asian jumping worm. Now, these look like night crawlers, but there's some specific differences between them, and we're going to discuss that as well. The information for this podcast comes from the Department of Natural Resources from Wisconsin. It's dnr.wisconsin.gov, and we're going to skip the rest of the URL. So just when you get there, just do a search for jumping worms. Now, jumping worms are non-native invasive earthworms native to Eastern Asia, and the challenges they present are, number one, they're hard to find, they're underground, and they're challenges to homeowners, gardeners, and forest managers. They get their name from their behavior. When disturbed, they thrash, jump in the air, and even shed their tails to try to escape. So what this edition of the Inside Out Gardener will try to do is show you how to identify them, their effects on yards and gardens, and what you can do to help get rid of them. The history of the Asian jumping worm, they first arrived in North America sometime in the 19th century, probably imported on plants and other horticultural and agricultural materials, which is why you shouldn't be buying plants from overseas. Since then, they've become widespread across the Northeast, Southeast, and Midwest US. In 2013, they were first confirmed in the upper Midwest. Now, if they got here in the 19th century, they probably weren't doing too much damage, but it took them quite a while to reproduce enough to get into the ecosystem. And in Wisconsin, all earthworms are non-native. How about that? There have been no native earthworms in Wisconsin since the last glacier moved through the state thousands of years ago. So why are jumping earthworms a problem? Well, unlike worm poop from regular earthworms, jumping worms can quickly transform soil into hard, dry pellets that have the texture of like discarded coffee grounds. So kind of abrasive, kind of chunky, and they form a somewhat impenetrable surface for a while. So they alter the soil structure that's unaccommodating to native and ornamental plants. And unfortunately, somehow these granular pellets, they deplete the soil of nutrients as opposed to regular earthworms that add organisms. And they also create places in the soil where invasive plants thrive, where the jumping worms live. So, unlike regular worms, Asian jumping worms don't add anything to the soil. They deplete it. They chase away other organisms because there's nothing for them to munch on. And they actually create an environment that's hospitable to invasive plants as opposed to native ones. The jumping worms don't burrow far into the soil, so if you're looking around, they're not hard to find. They live on the soil surface in debris and leaf litter, or within an inch or two of the topsoil, which is another reason not to leave all your garden debris laying in your garden. Okay. First of all, it doesn't do anything for overwintering insects. There's not enough there to protect them. I did a whole nother episode on that. It's now a place not only to harbor bad fungus, bad bugs, bad critters and rodents, it's now a place to harbor Asian jumping worms. So if you look for them in your garden, mulch pile, compost, potted plants, and other suitable surfaces, here's what they look like. Smooth, glossy, dark gray brown color. Sounds like a regular worm, don't it? And this thing called the clitellum, which is that, I call it a neckband. Kind of looks like a turtleneck sweatshirt. It's a light colored band, cloudy to white gray, that completely encircles the body. Its surface is flush with the rest of the body, as unlike where it stands up on some of the other ones. Snake-like movement, and they tend to occur in large numbers. Okay, regular earthworms we can find in large numbers. Night crawlers tend to be somewhat solitary. If you find one, there's always more. So the difference between a jumping worm from Asia and a European night crawler. Color of a jumping worm is brownish gray. Color of a European night crawler is pinkish reddish. The bodies on the jumping worm are sleek, smooth, and firm. Bodies on night crawlers are thick, slimy, and floppy. When disturbed, Asian jumping worms, they have snake-like movement, whereas night crawlers wiggle and stretch when disturbed. So they wiggle, it might look like they're a snake, but they stretch. So remember that when you see that night crawler, you think, wow, there's a big one. You go to grab him before he jumps in the hole when you're getting your fishing bait on out in the lawn on a nice summer night after it rains. These guys actually stretch. The Asian jumping worm doesn't. That round thing on their body that I call a neck collar is flush with the body, relatively close to the head, completely encircling the body, whereas on the European night crawler, it's slightly raised from the rest of the body and partially encircles the body, kind of like a horse on a saddle. So when to look for them? That's the jumping worms. They're most noticeable in late summer, early autumn, when they're fully mature. April to May, they're tiny worms forming cocoon-encased eggs. Summer months, the worms feed and grow. August to September, they reproduce, deposit egg-filled cocoons into surroundings. Jumping worms are parthenogenic. Each worm can reproduce on its own without a mate. That's the bad thing. They don't need mates like we do. In the first freeze, the adults die. The eggs spend cold months protected in the cocoons that are about the size of mustard seeds. It takes about 90 to 120 days between hatching and reproducing. The jumping worms, unlike European earthworms, can complete 2 generations per year in the northern climates. The real problem is not so much the worms, but the cocoons. Unlike other kinds of earthworms, jumping worms are parthenogenic. They self-fertilize, do not need mates. Each generation begins with the production of hardened egg capsules known as cocoons that overwinter in the soil, hatch the following spring. Jumping worm cocoons are very resistant to cold and drought, and since they resemble small bits of dirt, they're hard to notice, and so unknowingly moved in soil, potted plants, etc. So what do they do to the soil? What's the effect of these European jumping worms? They feed on organic matter, leaf matter, and mulch, like regular worms do, but they excrete grainy hard little pellets called castings that alter the texture and composition of the soil. So they're not beneficial like the European earthworms are. Besides consuming nutrients, animals, fungi, and bacteria need to survive. The resulting soil, which resembles large coffee grounds, provides poor structure and support for many understory plants. And like we mentioned earlier, invasive plant species may move in that are readily adaptable to these cocoon-like structures and the grittiness of their castings, whereas native plants are not. All earthworms, not just jumping worms, can harm forests by changing soil structure and forest floor vegetation. It's interesting. Their results can feed of a loss of moisture, compact soil, exposed roots, erosion, and an increase of pathogens and non-native plants. So they're saying both worms can do that. But it's just that the Asian jumping worm is quite invasive, and their castings you leave behind are not beneficial, like European night crawlers are. Management, there's no magic bullet, unfortunately, at least not yet. Management contains mostly of taking precautions to not move them onto or off of your property. However, if they're already there, there are a few things you can do to slow the spread. Prevention. Educate yourself and others to recognize these jumping worms. Watch for jumping worms and their signs of presence. Arrive clean, leave clean. Clean soil and debris from vehicles, equipment, and personal gear before moving to or from a recreational area that might contain jumping worms or their cocoons. Use and sell, purchase only landscape and gardening materials that appear to be free from jumping worms. Easier said than done. Only use compost that has been heated to appropriate temperatures to reduce the pathogens. So really not much you can do, but don't panic. By taking these precautions, you can continue to enjoy your yard. Just because you have jumping worms on your property doesn't mean they are everywhere. Remove and destroy them when you see them. Heat treatments. Heating worms and their cocoons are sensitive to high temperatures. The worms nor the cocoons can survive above 104 degrees for more than 3 days. So make sure you're composting properly to get that temperature up to 130, 40, which will kill them quickly. Chemical treatment. Biological insecticide Botanigard can significantly reduce the abundance of jumping worms. If necessary, try a variety of plants or consider alternative landscaping in heavily infested areas. And don't worry, keep your chin up as you experiment with controls and adapt gardening processes. Share your successes, they're asking, so they don't really have answers either. So that's pretty much it on the Asian jumping worm. Remember, there's a big difference between the two. When you see them, the Asian jumping worm will thrash and jump around and have movement like a snake, and the European nightcrawler will wiggle, but it'll also increase in length and kind of stretch when you touch it. So that's the biggest thing, the difference between them. And also that collar on their neck. On the jumping worm, that collar spreads all the way around their body and it's up by their head, whereas the one that collar on the European nightcrawler is reddish or pink, slightly raised, not flat to the surface like the Asian jumping worm, and it only encircles part of the body, kind of like a saddle on a horse. So for more information on the Asian jumping worm and what you can do about it, check your local Department of Environmental Conservation or Department of Natural Resources, whatever they call that environmental department in your state or county. Information for this episode of The Inside Out Gardener came from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, which you can find at dnr.wisconsin.gov. Got any questions or comments or something you'd like to hear on The Inside Out Gardener? You can reach us at Greg's Lawn Service and Garden Care on Facebook, The Indoor Gardener on Facebook, or the Facebook page for this and other podcasts, Wainwright Broadcasting. Till then, keep your shovels clean, and we'll catch you in the garden.